Hello, my name is Dr. Dave Webster, and this is part of my ongoing video blog series about the travesty of lack of access to PET-CT in Ontario. I hope you find this a very disturbing video blog. It's entitled "The Direct Actions of Cancer Cure Ontario and McMaster-based colleagues Will Lead to the unnecessary death of a 63-year-old male with lung cancer who has the misfortune of living in Ontario." Now, I'm making a couple of public statements here, as I said, backed by the medical literature and appropriate documents. One, the impending death of this 63-year-old man with lung cancer could have been avoided, or at least his death would have occurred many years later. Two, his death will be as a direct result of the absolutely deliberate actions of physicians from Cancer Cure Ontario and McMaster. Three, the methods that these physicians have used to block patients like this from access in Ontario are not based on the methods of science, as they will proclaim to the public. Four, they are based on a political agenda directed at Ontario's cancer, but also dementia, cardiac, and other patients. And this was pointed out by none other than, this is Professor Rodney Hicks, a respected international expert in PET, and he's from Australia. What he said to me was this, and I quote, "Ontario has the most egregious and politically motivated agenda against PET, and of course read our patients, in the world." And this is from July 2016. So this is the example here. This is Cancer Cure Ontario, McMaster. This is the images. If you're not familiar with it, you might have to look in another video to understand what PET is. But basically, we're looking at images of cells eating sugar. And this is normal cells like the brain here, but this is cancer here, as we will see. Now, the point is McMaster and CCO continue to say in 2018 there still is very little quality evidence to support the use of PET. Yet, look at the country of Turkey. They have just under 100 PET scans based on the same evidence. More importantly, locally, the 2017 Auditor General report noted that Ontario patients have the least number of PET scans per thousand population amongst any medical jurisdiction offering PET on the planet Earth. So this particular case will demonstrate many of the reasons why 20 years ago PET was the accepted world standard of imaging management of lung nodules and lung cancer patients. That is, of course, unless you have the misfortune of living in Ontario. So this is at 60, he was 61 actually at the time. Smoker has a CT, and it shows, you can see this is the right and left lung, and this is the top of the lung. There's a little nodule there. CT, remember, has zero ability to determine what that might be. I show this other view here because I'm going to talk about uptake in the middle of the chest, the mediastinum. This is part of the heart and great vessels. This is where the trachea splits here. So he has many CTs over the last interval, and the last one was in July of 2018. Now you can see that this has in fact increased very slightly. However, look at this here. It doesn't show that well in this particular picture, but believe me, this had had a rapid increase in size, and it was based on that they decided maybe they should go to the next stage of investigation. Now, he actually did get a PET CT in September of 2018. Now, normally, opposite to the rest of the world, he did not have to have a biopsy of his lung. That's normally the way it's done in Ontario, but they just deemed this was too dangerous for him. So he actually did get the proper approach, and that is the PET CT before the biopsy. But and without going into the detail, we can determine that the uptake amount of sugar was, we'll say, 3.7. So, and based on the rest of the PET scan, this is virtually certainly due to lung cancer, as I pointed out in other videos. Remember, this is just sugar, and so it could be lots of things. It could be infection, for example, but we'll see that it turns out that's not going to be the case. But also, I've said that, with PET we get other information that's impossible to get from CT. So the uptake value of 3.7 would not suggest that this is an aggressive cancer, and therefore the patient would typically have a much better prognosis. But what about that enlarging lesion in the middle of the chest? Here it is here, and you can see how much brighter that is, and it's quite big, and the FDG uptake value is 10.5. What about the added value? Well, what this demonstrates very nicely is something that oncologists struggle with, and that is the behavior of the metastatic lesion, this spread from that little nodule at the top of the right lung there, they can have quite different behaviors than their parent tumor. Now, this shows up nicely here. You can see on the whole body, that's how faint that is relative. Here in the uptake's 3.7, but you can see this one is in fact 10.5. Now, what does the 10.5 tell us? It tells us that this is an aggressive cancer with poor prognosis, and it wouldn't matter whether you pick this up really early. These patients do poorly and therefore require much more aggressive therapy. Only possible to know with PET scanning, of course. Here's another set of views. This is the front of the patient, the back, and the spine here. But I want to draw your attention to this here. This should not be here, and this almost certainly is spread of cancer to his spinal cord. Now, PET would be, and this is of course a very critical finding, but PET would be the only way that we would ever have had a chance of picking this up before it actually caused paralysis potentially to the lower half of his body. These are just some other views showing he's got metastasis here in bone. And so this is a classic stage 4 terminal cancer, but we also know this is going to be a very aggressive cancer. But how would this patient have been investigated beyond Ontario's borders? Well, the next investigation, of course, would have been a PET-CT. Now, at that time, we would have had the uptake would have been maybe 3.7. It might even have been less. Remember, so this would normally not mean the patient has cancer, but he would at that stage particularly. But he would definitely need to get some sort of a tissue biopsy, and in fact, it would have turned out to be a cancer. Now, what we don't know about that cancer, it is not an aggressive tumor. The rest of his PET scan would have been almost certainly normal, indicating there's no evidence there was any spread of that cancer at that point in January, February of 2017, and he would have had an excellent prognosis, and he potentially even would have had a cure. However, and for example, if we look in Quebec or Turkey, this patient could have been diagnosed within 6 to 8 weeks of that initial finding and then put on appropriate therapy. But let's look at this one here because he lives in Ontario. We now know that now in September 2018, this is a highly aggressive terminal cancer with prognosis, poor prognosis, and it will kill him. He has stage 4 widespread disease, and he will likely have a very miserable death, and possibly with paralysis to the lower half of his body. But also, what about all the anxiety this patient and his family went through waiting for those CT scans, going through the scan, waiting to hear at the doctor's office, can't tell, book another CT scan over all that time. Now, what about the time from the initial management to findings to diagnosis in Ontario? Remember, it could be as early as 6 to 8 weeks in Turkey or Quebec for that matter. 18 months. What happened in those 18 months, beyond all the anxiety that patient went through, and about to have a lot more, he will die, and that death will be courtesy of Cancer Care Ontario and McMaster-based physicians. Now, this is the Cancer Care Ontario website. Notice this, CCO, Our Future Healthcare Built with Care. This is their mandate. Look at this, accountability, integrity. These statements are vicious and cruel lies. These are some of the people that have been involved with the long-standing mandate to block patients from PET, and I can assure you they're all very proud of what they've done for the government on behalf of them to block PET, but they're challenged them, and they will threaten your license to practice medicine. Remember, though, that their actions have been officially condemned as unethical and bordering on immoral. But how about criminal charges? Back to Rodney Hicks. His efforts to determine or to expose what the Australian government and the bureaucrats did to block PET led to criminal charges. So, what do the non-government team members watching this video think about this? The only way, we need to demand that the 2005 CANM, CSNM motions demanding an ethical review utterly independent of the government take place immediately. That or massive lawsuits against the government are the only actions that will force Ontario politicians to stop this assault on patients like this 63-year-old man, which I assure you happen on a daily basis in Ontario. So here's my website and all the information, and thanks for listening.